The supply boat scraped against the cement landing just long enough for me to throw my duffel onto the rocks. Cormorant Point rose above us in a slab of wet granite. The lighthouse itself a pale finger pointing into a sky the colour of old pewter. Halloran was already waiting on the path, hands jammed into the pockets of a coat too thin for November. He was thinner than the coat. His eyes had the bruised look of a man who had stopped sleeping some while ago and made peace with it. He did not offer to help. When I started toward the cottage with my bags, he stayed planted on the gravel as if a line had been drawn there that he could not cross. He held out a laminated sheet, the edges worn soft from handling. "Lamp's the easy part," he said. His voice was flat, rehearsed. "Rules are on there. Follow them." I took the list. He was already turning back toward the boat. "One more thing." He paused without looking at me. "The door only ever needs to be opened from the outside." The engine coughed. By the time I understood I had a question, the boat was a smudge on the grey water, pulling away faster than it had come. The cottage smelled of damp wool and old wick smoke. I set the kettle on the hob and listened to it find its voice while I spread the laminated sheet flat on the kitchen table, smoothing the soft curl at its edges with my palm. Most of it was what I'd expected. Check the lamp at dusk. Log the weather in the book by the radio. Ration the kerosene. Do not let the brass tarnish. Sweep the gallery after gales. Practical things, the sort of list a man writes when he's tired of explaining himself. 3 lines sat lower on the page, set apart by a hand's width of empty plastic. Do not answer knocks before midnight. Do not answer knocks after midnight. If you hear your own voice on the other side of the door, do not speak back. I read them twice. The kettle began to hiss in earnest, a thin white sound climbing the stone walls. I laughed. It came out of me small and dry, and the room took it and gave it back changed, narrower, somehow further away than my own mouth. I stopped laughing. The kettle went on without me. The first 2 nights passed the way a held breath passes. I climbed the spiral stairs at dusk, my hand trailing the cold iron rail, and tended the lamp until the lens threw its slow wheel of light out across the water. I wrote in the log in the small neat hand my mother had taught me. Wind moderate, sea slight, visibility good. The brass kept its shine, the kerosene held. On the 3rd evening I walked the rocks at low tide, picking my way between weed and tidal pools that held the sky in pieces. I was almost back to the path when I saw them. A second set of boot prints in the wet sand coming up out of the water and going straight to the cottage door. None returned. I stood over them for a long time. The size was mine. The tread, when I lifted my own foot to check, was mine. The tide was already beginning to lick at the heels of the nearer prints, softening them, taking them back. Inside, the boots by the door were dry. I touched the leather to be sure. That night I wrote in the log, a trick of the light. I underlined it twice. The 4th night gave me nothing, which I should have recognised as a kind of warning. On the 5th I was reading by the radio when the knocking came. 3 soft taps, no more insistent than a neighbour calling round for sugar. The clock on the shelf read 11:15. I set the book down very slowly, as if the sound of a page settling might be heard through stone. I didn't answer. The taps came again a few minutes later, in the same patient rhythm, neither louder nor softer. Then again, then again. Whoever it was had all the time in the world and intended to use it. After the 4th round, a voice spoke through the wood. It said my name the way a friend says it when he is late and slightly embarrassed, drawing out the middle, almost laughing. I knew the voice. I could not place it, and the not placing was worse than the knowing would have been. The knocking stopped on the first stroke of midnight, cleanly, as though a hand had been lifted. I sat in the chair until the window paled. I was fully dressed. I was holding the kettle by the handle. In the morning I went to the radio with the steadiness of a man who has decided to be reasonable. I asked after Halloran. I asked lightly, the way you ask after a cousin. The dispatcher on the mainland was a woman called Maeve, whose voice I had come to know by its small dry coughs, and she did not cough now. She paused. The pause went on a beat longer than a pause should, and in that quiet I heard the hiss of the open channel, and beneath it, the sea. Halloran, she said, finished his rotation last spring. He has not been back since. The man on the supply boat was a stranger, hired for the handover and gone the same afternoon. I described him. The thin face, the careful voice, the way he held his cap by the brim as if it might fly. Maeve was quiet again. Then she said gently, That sounds like the keeper from 2 rotations before that. A man who walked into the sea one February and was never recovered. The static rose to meet her last word and swallowed whatever came after. I looked to the window. The tide was coming in fast. The knocking came back before the sun had finished going down. It started at the kitchen window, 3 soft notes against the salt-crusted glass, the way a child taps to be noticed. I was setting the kettle down and I froze with my hand still on the handle. By the time I turned, the sound had moved. The seaward shutter took it up next, 3 notes again, patient, almost polite, against wood that no living arm could reach without a ladder and a great deal of nerve. I climbed the spiral to the lamp because the lamp was my work and my work was the only rope I had. I trimmed the wick with hands that would not quite settle. Above me, on the trapdoor that opened to the gallery, 3 small knocks fell like coins onto a plate. Then the brass speaking tube beside the lens whispered. The voice that came up through it was my own, easy, almost amused, saying that it was cold out here and the boat was so far away, and would I please be a good fellow and let it in. I clamped both palms over the mouth of the tube and didn't answer. By the 10th night I had stopped sleeping in any honest sense. I closed my eyes between tasks and opened them to find the kettle, whistling, or the lamp guttering, or my own hand resting on a doorknob I did not remember reaching for. The rules were taped to every door and every mirror now, in ink that had begun to bleed at the edges from the damp. The cottage felt smaller. The walls did not move, but the distance between them had shortened. In some way I could measure only by how often my shoulder met the jamb. I opened the logbook for comfort, because the logbook was a thing I had made with my own hand. The early entries were mine. The later entries were also mine. They were not the same. The loops in the later letters leaned a fraction further, as though written by someone learning me. Pages had been added that I had not written. One, dated 3 days from now, said only, "Today, I finally answered." I tore it loose and fed it to the stove. The ashes shifted in the draught, settled into the same 6 words, held the shape a long moment, and then crumbled. On the final night the knocking did not come at all. I waited for it the way a man waits for a heartbeat he has grown used to listening for, and the absence opened a hole in the air of the cottage that nothing else could fill. The wind kept on. The sea kept on. The lamp turned its slow, patient circle. But the small, polite sound that had counted out my hours was gone, and the silence it left was the worst thing I had ever heard. At 1 minute past midnight a floorboard sighed in the kitchen, then another, nearer. Footsteps, unhurried, familiar, came along the hallway in the cadence I knew because it was my own. They stopped outside the bedroom in which I stood. A soft knock fell against the inside of the door behind me. I understood then. I had been the one outside all this time, knocking to be let back in. I remembered with a clarity that emptied me, stepping off the supply boat onto an empty jetty and finding the cottage door already open to the dark. Out on the rocks a thin man in a keeper's coat raised one hand in apology and walked quietly down into the tide. The Ardwick estate rose out of the October mist like something half-remembered from a dream, its grey stone darkened by a slow autumn rain that had stopped just before I arrived. Mrs. Ardwick met me on the front steps. She stood very straight, the way a person stands when they have been told repeatedly not to slouch. Her smile was patient, too patient. It did not move when she spoke, and it did not move when she paused. She handed me a laminated card, the edges worn soft from handling. Water the ferns in the conservatory, feed Wilkin, the greyhound, twice daily, dust the parlour every other morning, and at the bottom, in the same neat type, do not enter the east hallway between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning. I laughed. A small polite sound meant to invite her to laugh too. She didn't. The family loaded into a long dark car at the bottom of the drive. They waved in unison. I watched their eyes, 4 sets of them, and not one of them blinked. The youngest daughter, perhaps 19, held her chin slightly raised, very carefully, as though something invisible were balanced on the soft hollow of her throat. The first 2 days passed in a hush so complete I caught myself tiptoeing. Mara sketched in the sunroom while the light moved across the floorboards in slow honeyed inches, and Wilkin walked beside me through the apple orchard, at the pace of an old man with somewhere unimportant to be. I explored the house 1 room at a time. There were portraits everywhere, in the long gallery above the stairs, even tucked into the back of a linen closet as though someone had run out of walls. Generations of Ardwicks, in oils and silver gelatin and faded colour film, and every last one of them stood perfectly straight, with the chin lifted, eyes trained on some fixed point just above the lens. Even the children. I told myself it was only an old pose, the way the Victorians braced their dead against hidden frames to make them seem alive a little longer. That night, something woke me. A soft, repetitive sound from the east hallway, fabric dragging slow across wallpaper, back and forth, back and forth. I checked my phone. 1:58. I closed my door, turned a podcast up loud enough to drown a voice, and made myself sleep. On the fourth morning, I found Wilkin at the mouth of the east hallway, trembling so hard his collar made a tiny silver music against itself. He would not step onto the rug. He looked at me, then at the carpet, then at me again, the way a dog looks when it wants you to understand something it has no words for. I coaxed him back with a corner of cheddar from my pocket, and knelt to see what had spooked him. The rug was worn in places that did not match foot traffic. 6 long, parallel grooves pressed deep into the wool, each one the length of a shoe, arranged in a careful row. I laid my hand inside one. The wool was cold and densely flattened, as if something heavy had stood in that exact spot for years without ever shifting its weight. 6 grooves. I counted twice. There were 5 Ardwicks. I told myself I was being paranoid. That evening Mrs. Ardwick called. The connection stuttered, but I could see them, all of them, lined up behind her in the hotel room, shoulder to shoulder, chins lifted. Behind them, untouched, was a wide, neatly made bed. Not one of them was sitting down. I went into the library because the house was too quiet and my own thoughts were too loud. The shelves smelled of pipe smoke long settled into leather, and I let my fingers trail along the spines without any plan, only the need to be doing something with my hands. Behind a row of agricultural almanacs, set flush so its edge would not show, I found a small leather journal. The name pressed into the cover was Edgar Ardwick. The year was 1898. I sat on the floor and read by the window. Edgar wrote of a sickness in the bloodline, an inherited condition he called the long waking, in which sleep never quite came, and the body learned instead to rest while upright. He wrote of an arrangement the family had made with something in the walls of the East Hall, something that let them keep working, keep prospering, so long as they were offered the hours between 2 and 4. He did not say what was offered. He did not need to. The last entry was a single line in a careful, patient hand. The children are learning to stand now. I closed the journal. My hands were shaking. Outside, dusk had come early. I did not undress. I sat on the edge of the bed with my shoes still on, and watched the numbers on the small clock turn over, one by one, until the hour bent towards something I did not want to meet alone. At 1:45 I slipped down the corridor and settled at the top of the main staircase, knees drawn up, the greyhound a warm trembling weight against my thigh. From there I could see straight down into the mouth of the East Hall. At 2 o'clock exactly the house took a step. The sound did not come from any room. It came from inside the walls. Slow, measured footfalls, and not one set but many layered close, moving together the way a family moves through a long hallway at the end of a long day. The wallpaper began to swell. The pale roses bulged outward in 6 tall human shapes, lifted gently as if held by held breath, then sank back into the pattern. They rose again and again. Then I heard the humming, low, tuneless, almost tender, the sound a mother makes over a cradle. At 3:59 the wall went smooth. At 4 the house exhaled. I did not sleep. In the morning I packed before the light was fully up. My hands knew the shape of the work even while my mind drifted somewhere behind my eyes. I called Mrs. Ardwick from the kitchen phone and told her my sister was ill, that I was needed at home, that I was sorry. She listened the way she listened to everything, with the patience of someone who has already heard the ending. "It is a pity," she said. "The arrangement requires a sitter for the full 14 nights, dear. We are only on night 5. I told her I did not care about the money." "Oh," she said softly. "It was never about the money for you." The kettle ticked on the stove. The greyhound watched me from the doorway with wet, knowing eyes. "The rules," she said, "were not to keep you out of the East Hall. They were to keep the thing in the East Hall used to you, so that on the right night it would not notice the swap." "What swap?" I said. "We choose someone lonely," she said. someone whose absence comes quietly. We feed her to the house in small hours, 2 at a time, until it believes she's ours. Then we never have to stand again. The phone slipped from my fingers before I knew I'd let it go. I ran. The front door would not turn for me. Not the knob, not the deadbolt, not the long iron latch Mrs. Ardwick had shown me on the first afternoon as though it were a kindness. I went from room to room, trying every door, every window. The glass would not break. I swung the fireplace poker until my shoulders went hot, and my breath came in thin, ragged scrapes, and the panes only chimed back at me, calm as bells. My phone showed no bars at all, only a flat black line where the signal should have been, as if something had drawn a careful pen stroke through the world. I went to the sunroom because it was the brightest place I knew, and I sat in the middle of the floor with the poker across my knees and waited for daylight to mean something. It did not. At dusk I found my feet moving toward the east hall without my permission. My chin lifted slightly as if balancing a cup. I looked down at the runner. 7 sets of grooves now. The newest pair fit me exactly. The Ardwicks came home on the 15th day. The front door opened for them the way a mouth opens for a familiar spoon. No key, no turning, only a small sigh of wood against frame. The greyhound rose from the rug and went to meet them, tail moving in slow, contented arcs, as though they had only stepped out for the afternoon post. Mrs. Ardwick set her gloves on the side table and walked the length of the east hall, counting under her breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. At the 7th shape she paused and tilted her head, considering the long straight line of a young woman pressed faintly into the wallpaper, chin lifted, hands resting neatly at her sides. "Welcome to the family, dear," she said. "We will be back at 2. She crossed to the parlour and lowered herself into the armchair she had not used in 40 years, and the sigh that left her was so deep, so unburdened, it sounded almost like grief. Upstairs in the sunroom, an unfinished sketch waited on the easel, a self-portrait. The throat, the shoulders, the careful posture. The face had not yet been drawn. It never would be. My name is Wren Holloway, and I have lived in Aldermere all my life. It's the kind of valley town you find by accident, tucked between 2 long ridges that swallow the wind before it reaches our windows. We have 1 grocer, 1 chapel, 1 road inn. Above every front door in every house in Aldermere you will find a small brass bell. Mine is no larger than a walnut, tarnished green at the seams, and it has not rung in my lifetime. Once a decade, on the 2nd Thursday of October, the town conducts what the elders call the quiet census. No one announces it. No one prints it in the bulletin. But by sundown that evening, every porch light in the valley is burning, and every window is dark behind it. There are rules, and we learn them the way children learn to breathe. You leave the porch light on. You do not answer questions you were not asked. You never, under any circumstance, invite the census taker inside. I have lived through 3 quiet censuses already. I remember the first only as the smell of my father's coat as he held me against his chest, and the careful way he counted my fingers afterward, as if making sure none had been borrowed. My mother used to tell me, in that low voice she saved for true things, that the 4th is the one that matters. She never explained why. She died before I could press her on it. Tomorrow I turn 39. The week before the census, Aldermere learns my name a 2nd time. Mr. Coyle at the grocery slides the loaf of rye across the counter and waves my coins back at me without looking up. He has charged me every Tuesday for 16 years. Today his hand trembles against the till and he says only, "Take it, Wren, take it and go home." The mailman comes up my walk with his eyes fixed somewhere just above my shoulder, as if there is a second person standing behind me he would rather not acknowledge. He sets the envelopes on the porch rail instead of into my hand. On Wednesday, Mrs. Halpern catches me at the gate. She's normally a woman who could narrate a sermon out of a grocery list, but tonight she only folds a handkerchief into my palm and closes my fingers around it. Inside, a sprig of dried rosemary, brittle as a small bone. "My 4th was the hardest," she whispers. "Keep this near your throat." I open my mouth to ask her what she means, but she's already walking away, her shawl drawn up like a hood against nothing. That night, I dream of a line. It stretches across a field I do not know, and every person in it I half recognise, the way you recognise a face from a photograph that has been folded too long. Each of us holds a paper number, inked in a hand that is not our own. I wake clutching my left wrist. A faint smudge sits just under the skin, dark as wet ink. The evening of the census arrives the way deep snow arrives, without sound, and with the feeling that the world outside the window has grown one room smaller. I prepare the way my mother taught me, and her hands move inside mine while I work. I draw the well water and let it stand a moment in the pitcher before pouring, so the air can leave it. I set the glass in the centre of the kitchen table, where a person sitting would see it first. I pull out the chair opposite mine and leave it pulled back at exactly the angle a guest might leave it, neither welcoming nor refused. I place a single white candle in the front window and touch the wick with a match that takes 3 tries to catch. I draw every curtain in the house except the one facing the street. That one I leave open, the way you leave a door open for a dog you're not entirely sure you want back. At 7 sharp, the street lamps along Cobb Lane begin to fail. Not all at once. 1, then a pause long enough to count to 4, then the next, then another pause, the rhythm of a slow considering stride moving down the row. I count the houses going dark. 11, 12. When the lamp outside my window dies, the footsteps stop at my gate, soft and deliberate, and the brass bell above the door begins to hum, though no hand has touched it. 3 knocks come in the same, considering rhythm as the street lamps, evenly spaced, neither hurried nor patient. I cross the floor with my mother's hands still inside mine, and I press one eye to the peephole. The figure on my step is tall, taller than the doorframe will admit comfortably, and wears a grey wool coat the colour of pond ice in February. A clipboard is pressed flat against its chest, held the way a child holds a held breath. The face above the collar will not settle. I blink and the mouth is thinner. I blink again, and the eyes have moved closer together, then farther apart, as though something inside the skin is shifting its weight from one foot to the other. I cannot remember what I saw a heartbeat ago. Only the coat stays. The voice, when it comes through the wood, is mild and almost fond. It says my name. It says my mother's name, the way she said it herself, with the small catch on the second syllable. Then it says the name of a brother I have never had, and says it kindly, as if asking after him. It asks me to confirm the number of residents in the household. I say, 1. The pause that follows is long enough to feel the candle behind me lean. The pen scratches, unhurried, careful. Then the voice asks me to confirm the number of residents who are still breathing. I open my mouth. Nothing comes. Above the door, the brass bell begins to hum louder. It begins to read from the clipboard, and the questions arrive in the same measured rhythm as the knocks, as the failing lamps, as if some slow ledger were being walked down line by line. When did you last speak to your mother? I say a date. The pen scratches. When did you last hear her answer? I open my mouth, and the date I meant to say will not assemble itself, and I give a different one, smaller, further back. The pen scratches longer this time. Do you remember the colour of the front door of the house you grew up in? I say green. The pen does not move at all, and the silence of it is worse than the scratching. I answer carefully, the way I was taught to answer strangers at thresholds, but my voice sounds thinner than it should, as though it were being drawn out of me along a length of wire. Through the narrow gap beneath the door I can see the shadow of its feet, and there are too many of them, arranged in a quiet symmetry, the way the legs of a patient animal settle when it has decided to wait. It tells me in that mild and almost fond tone that my entry has been amended in the previous 3 censuses, and that tonight is the reconciliation. I ask what that means. The pen lifts. The voice softens further, almost tender, and tells me to check the handkerchief Mrs. Halprin gave me. I unfold the handkerchief on the table with the slow care of someone disarming a thing that might still be alive. The rosemary breaks apart at my touch, dry and sweet, and the smell of it lifts into the room like a small green prayer. Beneath the brittle stems lies a folded slip of paper, soft at the creases from having been folded and unfolded by a hand I would know anywhere, my mother's handwriting. The year's written first, the year I was 9, and the rest moves across the page in the careful slant she used for important things. If you are reading this, the bell rang for you in 1995, and we agreed to let you stay one more cycle. I love you. I am sorry. The room tilts in a quiet way, not toward falling, but toward remembering. A fever I had not thought of in decades returns whole. A long hallway of half-familiar faces, a number written on my wrist in an ink that stayed through 3 baths and a Sunday. My mother on the porch in her thin housecoat, speaking low and steady to a man in a grey coat whose hat I could not see past, while I watched through the spindles of the stair rail and learned, without knowing I was learning, how a mother sounds when she's buying time. I look down at my left wrist. The smudge I have lived with as a birthmark has darkened, sharpened, settled into shape. The number is 4. The voice when it comes again is doubled, 1/2 outside the door and 1/2 already inside the room, layered so closely that the seam between them is no seam at all. It says that the household has been carrying a debt for 30 years, and that the ledger must balance before sunrise. It says this the way a kind clerk might say that the office is about to close. Then it asks with that same soft fondness whether I would like to walk out, or whether I would prefer it to walk in. I understand finally what Mrs. Halprin meant when she said the 4th census is the hardest. She did not mean for her. She meant for the one being counted. She meant for me. I think of my mother bent over this same paper, writing the year, writing her apology, folding rosemary in around it like a charm against weather she could not name. The chair I pulled back from the table earlier, the one I have left empty at every meal since I was a child, is no longer empty. Something is sitting in it now, wearing her cardigan, the pale blue one with the small pearl buttons, and the wool is settled on the shoulders just the way she used to settle it, with one cuff turned in. The head does not turn toward me. It will not. I can hear, very faintly, the sound of breathing being practiced and not quite remembered correctly. I made my choice the way you make a choice in a dream, with my body moving a step ahead of my will. I leaned over the candle and blew, and the small flame bent and went, and the kitchen exhaled into a darkness that felt older than the house. The thing in my mother's cardigan did not stir. It only kept practicing its breath, soft and wrong, like a child learning a hymn by guessing at the words. I reached above the door and lifted the brass bell down with both hands. It was heavier than I remembered, the way grief is heavier than its size. The clapper did not sound. I do not think it was meant to, not yet. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold blue air of Cobb Lane. The census taker was waiting at the gate, clipboard lowered, and as I came down the path his face gathered itself out of the dark and settled, at last, into something I knew. It was my own face at 39, patient and tired, holding a pen. I understood then. The taker is never a stranger. He is the version of you the town agreed to send back, one slow cycle at a time, until the ledger comes due. I lifted the clipboard from my own waiting hands. Behind me the front door opened, and someone who was no longer me stepped inside to finish my life. Down the lane, another porch light came on. A child was turning 9. The drive up had been longer than I remembered. The maples already burnt down to rust, and by the time I turned onto the gravel road that led to my grandmother's house, the sky had settled into the colour of wet slate. Mr. Halloran, the lawyer, had warned me on the phone that Inez had grown eccentric toward the end. He used that word twice, carefully, the way you handle something you do not want to drop. The key still worked. The door swung inward on the same tired groan I remembered from childhood, and the smell of her hallway met me at once. Cedar and old paper and the faint sweetness of apples kept too long. Then I saw the mirrors. Every one of them in the foyer had been turned to face the wall. The tall oval by the coat rack, the small gilt thing above the side table, even the little decorative pane set into the hall tree. In the downstairs bathroom the medicine cabinet had been covered over in brown butcher paper, taped down at every edge with the patient overlapping of someone who had time and worry to spare. On the kitchen counter, the toaster wore a folded dish towel like a hood. I smiled, the sad, practised smile you learn for these things, and took out my phone to start a list of repairs. That was when I saw the note in her shaking hand, on lined paper beside the sugar bowl. Do not uncover them after dark. I laughed once. Then I stopped, because the house was very quiet. I uncovered the oval in the foyer first, because it was the largest and the silliest looking, draped against the wall like a scolded child. The cloth slid down with a whisper. My reflection looked back, ordinary and tired, hair flattened from the drive, a small smear of road salt at my collar. Nothing moved that should not have moved. I told the woman in the glass that she was being foolish, and she agreed with the same thin smile. In the kitchen I put the kettle on and let the gas tick up into its small blue crown. The tea was hers, loose, kept in a tin painted with pheasants. I carried the cup down the corridor to her study, where the lamp still had its green shade and the desk still smelled faintly of pencil shavings. The journals filled an entire shelf, 40 years of them, bound in cloth the colour of dried moss. The earliest pages were a girl's hand, looped and eager. She wrote about a game she and Marta played at the vanity upstairs, a chant repeated until the candle guttered, an invitation pressed against the silvered glass like a palm. Marta had been 14 when she went missing. The town had called it running away. Inez had written only one line about it, much later, in a hand grown careful with age. She did not leave. She only changed sides. I closed the book. From the foyer, the oval mirror was breathing a soft, even fog across its face. I did not sleep in her room. The bed there was made too neatly, the pillows arranged the way you arrange things when you do not expect to come back, and I could not bring myself to disturb that small final tidiness. The guest room smelled of cedar and old linen. I lay listening to the house settle, every joist and pipe announcing itself like an introduction, and at some point I must have drifted, because the tapping pulled me up out of nothing at exactly 3:14. It was patient. A fingernail, I thought, against glass. Not insistent, just counting. I lay very still and told myself it was the radiator clicking through its cycle. That old iron made stranger sounds than that the wind outside had found an eave. The tapping stopped when I sat up. The hallway, when I stepped into it, was cold in the particular way hallways are cold when something has just left them. The cloth I had draped over the long mirror that evening lay puddled on the runner, as if it had simply slid down on its own. I redraped it and went back to bed and did not sleep. In the morning there was a handprint on the inside of the glass, a child's hand, fingers spread, pressed from the wrong side. I took a photograph. I wet a corner of the cloth and wiped. My reflection wiped too, a half-second late. I froze. She caught up. I told myself I had imagined it. The road into town curled between fields gone the colour of old paper, and the truck's heater wheezed at me the whole way down. The grocer was a man named Halvar, thin as a rake handle, with hands that had forgotten how to be still. He knew me before I said my name. He said Inez had been kind. He said the family had been marked a long time, and he would not say by what. He told me Marta still came to the store after, never inside, only ever across the road in the bakery window, or reflected in the butcher's case when no one stood there to cast her. Never in person, he said, and crossed himself with the small embarrassment of a man who had stopped believing years ago and started again recently. I asked for a hand mirror from the dusty rack near the register. He looked at me a long moment and then quietly moved the rack behind the counter and rang up the rest of my things without speaking. On the drive back the sun was low and the rear view was full of pale road. Then it was not. A small shape sat behind the passenger seat, knees drawn up, hair hanging forward. I turned. Empty belt, empty vinyl, a single thread of frost across the window. I drove on. A mile later she was there again, watching me in the mirror with a patience that had already outlasted everyone who ever loved her. The journals were stacked on the kitchen table where I had left them, and I read by the low yellow light over the sink because the bulb in the parlour had gone out that afternoon, and I had not wanted to climb on a chair after dark. Inez had a steady hand and a system. The covered mirrors were not grief. They were a wall. She drew small diagrams in the margins, the house in plan, each glass marked with a cross or a circle. The crosses were sealed. The circles were left bare on purpose, mirrors she had turned inward, propped backward, set facing other mirrors so they tunnelled into themselves. Lures, she called them. Rooms within rooms where Marta could wander and not feel for the seams. Inez had been feeding her, in a fashion. 40 years of offering her sister specific pains so she would not learn to look through the rest. The last entry tapered. She's learning new surfaces, Inez had written, the letters thinning. She watched me through the kettle today. The copper. I had not thought. I do not know how much longer The sentence simply stopped. A small ink pool at the period that was not a period. I lifted my head. Across the kitchen the microwave faced me with its polished black window, and in that small dark pane I saw my own face lit yellow. and over my shoulder a thin, pale shape that the room behind me did not contain. I moved through the house like something hunted, an armful of linens shedding behind me, and I began with the kitchen because the microwave still held that second shape. I draped a dish towel over its face and taped the edges down. The toaster next. The kettle, which I turned to the wall. The oven door took a long strip of masking tape across its black glass, and the tape made a small dry sound as I pressed it flat. I climbed the stairs with sheets bundled to my chin and covered the standing mirror in the hall. The framed prints whose glass had begun to seem too attentive. The little round window at the landing that gave back the lamp. When I came back down, the compact on Inez's dresser lay open like a small bright eye. I had closed it. I knew I had closed it. In the dining room a spoon sat bowl up on the cloth catching the bulb. In the parlour someone had filled a glass bowl with water and set it on the floor where I would have to step around it. The tapping had spread. It was in the window panes, in the cabinet fronts, in the slow domed curve of the light bulb above the sink. Then a voice, soft and reasonable, drifted from behind the bathroom door. "Please come and brush my hair." "I have waited so long," Inez promised. I did not answer. I sat down in the middle of the kitchen floor and closed my eyes. Dawn came the way it comes in old houses, not as light, but as a greying of the dark, a thinning at the edges of every covered thing. I sat up from the kitchen tiles with my mouth dry and my decision already made. I would leave. I would take what fit in one bag and I would walk out the front door and not look at the windows on my way down the path. I packed quickly. I did not turn on a lamp. In the bathroom I set the bag against the wall and bent over the sink and ran the cold tap, and I splashed my face once, twice, and lifted my head before I remembered. The mirror I had uncovered that first night looked back at me. I had never put a sheet across it. I had forgotten. The reflection smiled before I did. She was a girl of perhaps 14, hollow at the eyes, hair wet and dark against her temples, wearing my sweater, my collar, my small silver chain. I could not move. She pressed both palms flat against the glass from her side, and I felt the pressure settle on my chest from mine, slow and certain as a hand laid down to keep me still. Her lips shaped the words without sound. "Thank you for letting me out." Behind her, on her side of the room, an old woman sat on the edge of the tub and wept into her hands. She had my grandmother's face, then she had mine. I walked out of that house in my own body, and it was not my walk. The hips moved differently. The hand that pulled the door closed behind me did it with a small, satisfied sigh, the sigh of a person settling into a coat that has hung too long in a closet. The key turned smooth as butter. The path I had been so careful of, every loose stone of it smoothed itself under feet that already knew the way. In the car I adjusted the rear view without thinking, and that was the worst of it, the without thinking. I met my own eyes in the mirror, and my own eyes met me back a half-second late, the way a bad line crackles on a long-distance call. From behind the glass of myself I watched my mouth lift at one corner. I watched my hands settle on the wheel as though they had missed it. I pounded on the surface from the inside. I screamed against something that had no thickness and no give. No sound came. Outside, the engine turned over, sweet and willing. We pulled away from the curb, toward town, toward the bakery and the post office, toward every shop window and rain puddle and dark phone screen waiting patiently in the world. The last thing I saw before the car took the corner was a small pale hand rising from the back seat to rest gently on my shoulder. The driver did not flinch. The driver had been waiting 40 years to be touched again. The rain had started somewhere outside Millbrook, and by the time I reached Pine Hollow it had thickened into that slow, patient kind of weather that settles in for the night and refuses to be hurried. The old Exchange building sat at the end of Cooper Street the way I remembered it, narrow-shouldered and stubborn, its brick darkened to the colour of wet tobacco. I let myself in with the key the Historical Society had mailed me, and the smell rose up to meet me like an old friend. Bakelite. Dust warmed by decades of summer attics, a faint sweet trace of the talc the girls used to keep on their wrists so the sweat would not stick to the keys. I stood in the doorway for a long moment and let myself be 20 again. The switchboard waited under a pair of yellowed bedsheets in the main room. I lifted them carefully, folding them the way my mother taught me, and there it was, the long oak face of it, every jack and cord exactly where I had left them in the autumn of 1979. Above it, the round Seth Thomas clock had stopped. The hands rested at 14 minutes past 3. I told myself clocks stop, springs wear out, buildings settle into their own particular silences. But I heard Mrs. Avery's voice anyway, the way I had heard it 100 times on my first week of training. Never plug into line 17 after 3 in the morning, Margaret. Not ever. She had never explained, and I had never asked, the way you do not ask certain things when you're 16 and grateful for the work. The rain pressed harder against the windows. I decided to stay. I carried my overnight bag up the narrow stair to the room the operators had once used for naps between shifts, and I set my kettle on the little hot plate in the corner. The cot was still there. The wool blanket smelled faintly of cedar. I told myself I was only delaying the inevitable, and I went back down to the office shelves where the logbooks waited in their long brown row. The handwriting met me like a face in a crowd I almost knew. Doris Pelham's loops, Eleanor Briggs's careful slant, entries about quiet voices on lines that had been disconnected the previous spring, a subscriber on Walnut Street who placed 3 calls on a Tuesday in 1962, though his obituary had run the Saturday before, and again, written across the margins in a red ink that had gone the colour of old blood, the same warning. Line 17 after 3. Do not answer. Do not plug through. I turned a page and my own hand looked back at me. 16-year-old loops. The M in Margaret a little too tall the way I used to make it before I trained myself out of the habit. The entry was dated October 9th, 1979. Call received, line 9. Female caller identifying herself as Margaret Halloran, age 62. Calling from the Exchange Building. Caller advised me not to be alone here. Caller disconnected at 14 minutes past 3. I closed the book very gently, the way you close a door on a sleeping animal. In the kitchenette, the kettle began its thin, rising cry. I poured the water over the leaves and watched my hands shake. Outside, the wind found a new throat in the eaves, and the building exhaled around me, slow and long and almost patient. The tea had gone lukewarm in my hands when the bell rang. It was such a small sound, no louder than a spoon tapping the rim of a cup, and yet it stopped the breath in my throat. I set the cup down on the desk and listened to the building listen back. The bell rang again, soft and tinny, the way I remembered them ringing on slow Sunday afternoons when the whole town seemed to be napping at once. I crossed the floor without deciding to. The switchboard rose in front of me like an old altar, dark except for one jack near the top row where an amber bulb pulsed at the slow rate of a sleeping heart. I did not remember that bulb. I'd learned every lamp on this board the way other girls learned hymns, and this one had never been part of the catechism. I told myself there must be a battery somewhere in the cellar, still holding a thread of charge. I told myself a great many things. The headset hung on its hook the way I had left it half a lifetime ago. I lifted it. The leather of the band was cracked, but it settled against my ears as if it had been waiting. For a long moment I heard only the hush inside the wires, that vast, soft ocean. Then a man's voice came through, very close, very patient, whispering my maiden name. He asked if the line was clear. He said he needed to place a long-distance call to 1974. I tore the headset off. The amber light died at once. But when I turned, the operator's chair behind me had swiveled all the way around, and it was facing the board. The chair did not move again while I watched it, but I felt watched in return, and I went for the door the way a fish goes for open water. The knob turned. The door did not. The rain had drunk its fill of the wood, and the frame had closed around it like a soft mouth, and no amount of my shoulder would convince it otherwise. I went back to the desk for my keys. The desk was bare. I had set them on the blotter when I came in. I remembered the small, bright sound of them, the cold of the brass ring against my palm. They were not there now, and the blotter held only the long, shallow dent where they had lain. The logbook lay open beside it, turned to a page I had not turned to. The handwriting was my own. I knew the loop of my G, the tired slant of my T, the way I crossed nothing all the way through. The entry was dated tomorrow. It described, in the calm, clipped language we'd been trained to use, a woman entering the office at 8:15, lifting the headset, accepting a call from an unlisted exchange. The last line read, "Subscriber failed to disconnect, transferred to permanent staff." I tore the page free. I struck a match at the sink and watched my own writing curl and blacken and go to soft grey lace down the drain. The smoke smelled like wet hair. When I turned, the book was open again. The same entry. The ink still wet enough to catch the lamplight. Behind me, one by one, in the slow, patient order of a hymn being remembered, the bells on the board began to ring. The first bell was the third drop on the left, and my hand went to it before my mind did. 40 years of training will move a body the way a tide moves a boat. I seated the plug, lifted the headset and said the words I'd said 10,000 times. Number, please. A man's voice came through, thin with worry, smelling somehow of hay and diesel. He needed Dr. Lowell out at the Mercer place. The heifer was down and would not rise. I knew him before he gave his name. I had placed that call on a Tuesday in the fall of 1976, and I had stayed on the line long enough to hear the doctor promise he was coming. "Thank you, Margaret," the farmer said, soft as a hand on a shoulder. "I will see you soon." The next bell, a young mother asking for Fort Jackson, her voice bright and breakable. Then a doctor, clipped, requesting the ambulance to a house on Poplar Street where a child's grandfather had fallen. Then a woman who only wanted to hear her sister's voice in Tulsa before the weather turned. Each one I remembered. Each one thanked me by name. Each one said they would see me soon. I knew their faces from the obituary column. I had clipped some of them myself, folded them into the back of the logbook, a small private liturgy of the served and the gone. On the wall above the door, the clock that had been silent since I arrived gave a single dry click, the way a throat clears before speaking. Then another. Then it began to tick in earnest, steady and certain, and the long black hand swept backward across the face. The bells settled like birds at dusk, and in the hush that followed, one drop remained dark and waiting. 17. The brass eye of it caught the lamplight and held it, patient as a coin at the bottom of a well. I knew the rule. I had taught the rule. Never plug 17 after midnight. Not for any voice, not for any reason. I stepped back from the board, and my knees remembered the chair before my mind did, and I made them remember the floor instead. The amber bulb above the cord began to pulse, slow and warm, and I felt my own pulse answer it without permission, the two of them keeping time like dancers who had practiced. In the polished curve of the board's brass plate, my reflection sat where I had been sitting. It had not risen with me. It had not turned. It only watched the lamp with the small, composed smile of a woman waiting to be useful. A footstep in the back hallway, soft as a page turning. I did not have to look. I knew the careful tread, the way the left heel always met the boards a breath later than the right. Eleanor came into the lamplight wearing the rust-coloured cardigan with the pearl buttons, the one she had been mending the morning her hand stopped halfway to her tea. She smiled at me the way she used to smile when a new girl cried at her first wrong connection. "It is all right, Margaret," she said. "The night shift has been short-staffed for such a very long time. You were always meant to come back. That rule about 17, dear, that was never a warning. That was your reservation." The understanding came the way the tide comes to a flat shore, all at once and from every direction. The clock had stopped at 3:14 because that was when I would arrive, not when she had gone. The ledgers were filled in my hand because they had always been mine, every careful column reaching back through years I had not yet lived. The call I had placed from 1974, the voice on the other end of the line warning a younger woman about line 17, had not been a warning at all. It had been a confirmation, a circle finding its own teeth and closing them gently. I smoothed my skirt the way Eleanor had taught me, palm flat from waist to knee, and I sat. The chair received me without complaint. My reflection in the brass plate finally turned its head to meet me, and we agreed about everything. The cord lifted as if it had been waiting all its working life for my hand. I plugged into 17, and the warm hum travelled up my wrist and settled behind my collarbone like a held breath, finally given somewhere to rest. "Good evening," I said. "How may I direct your call?" Beyond the windows the rain stopped between one drop and the next. In the morning the volunteers let themselves in with the Historical Society's brass key, and found the sheets settled neatly over the board, the air undisturbed, the new ledger open to a fresh page. The night shift is fully staffed. The entry read in a hand they did not recognise and would later mistake for charm. Subscribers may resume calling at their convenience. The clock above the door read 3:14. In the quiet, a single bell began to ring.